I am often very curious about why it is that for Chinese nationalism and for people who are very nationalistic, why do you want to keep Tibet or Xinjiang? Because people get very emotional about it, and yet it is this land that for many people perhaps they have never been, and they have never encountered people who live in those areas. So what makes it so important?
Hello, I'm James Carter, professor of history and provost at St. Joseph's University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this interview series sponsored by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Today I'm going to be talking with Professor Shellen Wu about her book, Birth of the Geopolitical Age, Global Frontiers and the Making of Modern China, which is published this year by Stanford University Press. By way of introduction, I want to say, and I'll give Shellen a chance to introduce herself. First of all, it's a pleasure to see you again. Shellen and I first met, and I'm trying to remember exactly what year it was, but we first met, and correct me if you have this, if you differ, but at Small World Coffee in Princeton, when her dissertation director had pulled me in to kind of talk about some similarities that we had in our interests and possible paths forward. So it's been a real pleasure to see Shellen's career take off the way that it has, and even now where we both find ourselves as fellows in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program. So Shellen, with that, I'll say nice to see you again, and I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. And it's wonderful that we are actually now both back in the same region where we first met. So my name is Shellen Wu, and I am an associate professor of history and the Gibson Chair in Transnational History at Lehigh University. And thank you so much to the National Committee for arranging this conversation today.
Well, with that said, this book is one of those that I find really attractive, and I was really happy to get the opportunity to talk with you about it, partly because I know your work and I expected it to be of really high quality, and I was not disappointed, but also that it crosses a lot of, dare I say, borders, frontiers even. But maybe you could say a little bit about how you came to write the book, and I'm thinking in particular about the way you structured it. I think one thing that I know that you're a science fiction fan, and so I thought that you've used these notions of sort of networks, even fungal networks that showed up in The Last of Us and things like that, where you have these nodes in different places. Hopefully nothing in your book is going to cause the apocalypse, but the idea that there is nodes and networks and how they bring together these different parts of the world, but not necessarily in the ways you might expect. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about that a little bit as a way of introducing the topic and the way you approached it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, with new research projects, it always starts with a little question, and sometimes these little questions leads down the rabbit hole and lead to other bigger questions. So when I first started, I was thinking about a map of China and the way that the map of the Qing Empire really overlaps mostly significantly with the map of the People's Republic of China. And yet that they cross these divide from empire to nation state. So why is that? And then I started to read about frontier studies in different contexts, in American history, in European history, intercolonization in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And then from there, other interests led me to look up into the literature on the science of science and network science. And I also read these new works, mushroom science, which is a very big thing. And I thought it really raised some interesting points. One is that network science has this concept called preferential attachment. So it's if you if you trace the traffic on the internet, it's not evenly spread out. It actually, there are particular hubs where you see a lot of activity, and they could be the places that you would expect. So Facebook, for example, or particular areas where you see the most traffic. This also corresponded to the way that they I mean, apparently there's all kinds of things that we don't understand about how mushrooms and fungal networks communicate, and about how trees in a forest communicate because of their fungal networks. And at some point I thought, this might be a really interesting way to structure a book where, to get around this kind of strictly chronological periodization of how we understand history. So dividing into Qing history, Republican history, or the People's Republic of China. And that's actually, if you look at specific individuals, you see that people's lives crossed all three periods, and that these political divides did not really map onto people's individual lives. And this is when I thought, I went through many drafts, and some of the early reviewers thought that, this is a little confusing because these figures pop up in these different places. And I thought that this network science approach, this idea of hubs, both physical but also intellectual hubs, conceptual hubs, would be a way to structure the work and to show the way that how people's lives, but also ideas, crisscrossed and encountered one another in these hubs.
No, I think it's brilliant. I mean, because as we were talking about a little bit, I've often struggled with how to tell stories in ways that aren't chronological, because there's so many other ways to approach a problem, to approach a question. So I thought that was really a useful way to go at it, and so I admire it a lot. Let me shift to a little bit to the book itself. What do you think the book What do you think is the contribution that this book is making to our understanding of China today? And I know this is a little bit removed talking about a book of history, but I'm looking at it. I was struck by your introduction, your preface, when you really drew upon both the moment of the pandemic, which kind of brought you back, like many of us. You had to return into files and stuff that you'd collected previously because you couldn't make those trips. But also you looked back on a trip that you had made out to Xinjiang, and how that was affecting, how that really shaped the questions that you asked about China, about Qing China. So I'm wondering if this question about, how it is that this notion of geomodernity, and maybe explain this notion of geomodernity a bit, how you see that history as playing out in maybe contemporary debates about China and its neighbors.
Yeah, so absolutely. One thing is, I use this term geomodernity because you see a lot of discussion of geopolitics today. And people use it in the news, people use it in writing about geopolitical tensions between US and China, for example. But the term geopolitics itself was not coined until the 20th century. And so geomodernity, I see it as the larger umbrella term to refer to this cultural, technological, scientific changes that made possible this geopolitical view. The other thing is about the work is that I really make the argument that, one, this transition from empire to nation state is perhaps overstated, and that empire continued to influence how people thought about territory and thought about the organization and purview of the state. into the 20th century, well after a number of these empires, the Ottoman, the Qing, the Russian Empire collapsed. And so in the contemporary resonance is that in the conclusion, I brought up that what you see today is in the war in Ukraine, for example, the way that there is an effort to bring back the Soviet Empire. But also in the way that both the US and China and Japan and Germany, in these cases that I refer to in the book, really addressed how to remake empire for the modern age. In the US case, this is a form of deterritorialized empire, sometimes under the guise of transnational corporations instead of strictly a state-sponsored effort. In the case of China, you see that in these efforts with the Belt and Road Initiative. But also in the way that the states have, kind of re-envisioned empire, sometimes not specifically, intentionally not using the term empire to describe what they're doing. And that you can trace this process through the way that these efforts were first experimented on in borderlands and on the frontiers. And I mean the frontier not only in the physical frontier, but especially in the latter half of the 20th century in metaphorical frontiers. And when I was finishing up the book, it was absolutely fascinating to see that the newest supercomputer that the United States has brought online in 2022 in Oak Ridge National Laboratories, they called it the frontier. And that this is the fastest supercomputer, the next step towards quantum computing. So we still see the way that these different countries around the world are competing to dominate the next frontier.
Oh, there's so much in there. Let me pull out a couple of pieces. I really appreciate what you're saying about the transition from empire to nation state as being sort of overstated or overrated. That like you probably, I wound up teaching a fair amount of world history, and so we're talking about the growth of nationalism, and there's this general statement, right, that the world had been organized into empires and then became organized into nation states. And there's many things that are true about that statement, but when you dig into it, it's kind of like peeling an onion. It becomes very difficult to define what the core difference is between those two. There's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of difference and distinction. Do you see this concept of geomodernity? Is there a way that concept can be helpful as we look at some of the more intractable kind of territorial problems that occur on the margins of China? So, and I'm thinking and feel free to bring in any example you like, but I'm thinking of the case of Mongolia, which was incorporated in the Qing Empire, but then achieved independence. And there were some other smaller states that briefly followed that same trajectory, though they didn't continue. Xinjiang, right, which is one that sort of was pried out, became independent sort of nominally in the 30s and 40s, but never continued after that, but remains a real live question. Obviously, Dongbei in Manchuria has a conflicted relationship. Tibet and Taiwan, like all these areas on the edge, which really underscore that distinction between the nation state and the empire. That's far too much for you to answer, but is there any one or two of those that you would like to focus on, see how your approach helps us to understand and maybe make sense of those places and the situation in which they find themselves?
Yeah, this is one of those things where if you look at Lei Qing and into the 1910s and the early Republican period, there are a number of intellectuals who promote this idea of Han nationalism, but with the exception that they embrace nationalism, but they don't want to give up these borderland. So then what is the justification for that? Why would you want to hang on to Mongolia or Xinjiang or Tibet or the Southwest if your basic premise is of an ethnic nationalism? And this is where I think this concept of geomodernity, where these people cast about looking for a solution. And so first is that they blame imperialism. We want to hang on to these territories because, you know, these imperialists are looking to encroach upon China. And if we give away these borderlands, then we're just giving away to the imperialists, foreign imperialists. But the second thing is that this becomes a way, geopolitics becomes a way to justify retaining these territories, retaining the resources on these territories, while at the same time promoting nationalism. And
No,
I
that's
do
it's
think that, yeah.
no, I agree. It's such a rich topic. I mean, we talk about a lot, and I think you put your finger on it. We talk about the kind of super nationalists or hyper nationalists, often on the internet to do with China, but oftentimes those nationalists are talking about these spaces that for an ethno-nationalist would not be seen as Chinese, and that they're identified as core parts of the nation. So I think there's a really rich vein that you've tapped here. But you were starting to say something else before you interrupted.
Yeah, I was going to say that you see that in the contemporary context as well. I am often very curious about why it is that um, for Chinese nationalism and for people who are very nationalistic, why do you want to keep Tibet or Xinjiang? Because, you know, people get very emotional about it, and yet it is this land that for many people perhaps they have never been, and they have never encountered people who live in those areas. So what makes it so important?
And it makes perfect sense in the context of an empire,
Mhm.
because if you have a core in these colonial territories that are part of your empire, it makes sense that they would differ so dramatically from the core. But it seems to go against the notion of the nation state. So I think your approach is a fascinating one. Um, well, shifting just a little bit, because I think you've mentioned it a couple of times. You mentioned a couple of different cases, and I know from your own background that Germany and China are two places that you've done you do research to do with both of those places. You're a comparativist in some ways of with Germany and China. It's really hard to think of two countries um, that are much more important certainly in the course of the 20th century, like the period that you're covering from the middle of the 19th and middle of the 20th century. China and Germany have outsized importance and certainly very different paths forward, both intersecting with the United States in really interesting ways too. Can you talk a little bit about the pitfalls and opportunities that come from doing, whether you want to frame it as global history or comparative history, which I know can set off its own sub debates. But what are the perils of doing that in general, but also with these two particular subjects? Anything that comes to mind as to how those have challenged and opened up your world?
Well, one is that I think the comparative history has certain limits because it's very difficult to compare two countries with very different histories. So the way I got around that is by taking the approach of connections in global history, but also tracing individuals. So a lot of these influences and connections that you mentioned between the US and Germany, between Germany and China, between Germany and Japan, are through these social scientists and scientists. You see that very clearly in the American historian Dan Rogers' book on Atlantic crossings, the way that the German social sciences were highly influential on the establishment of the American Economic Association, sociology, and geography in the US. you also see considerable overlap in the way that you have Japanese who were trained in Germany, as well as Chinese intellectuals. And this is all part of this network, right? That goes from university to university through these intellectuals who then return to their home countries and carry out some of these ideas. So one thing I draw out in the book is that this remarkable similarity in German plans to use veterans to settle in Eastern Europe in these conquered territories, which was first brought up at the end of World War I, and also in a very similar idea that was implemented in China during World War II. And that is absolutely amazing. And I think that by tracing these individuals, this is where you realize that archives are organized. This is a product of this age of the nation. And they are organized in these siloed geographical areas. But once you actually look at individuals, it's absolutely amazing how people turn up in multiple places. So I went to German archives and found correspondences where people were talking to, this agronomist, Max Ziering. He was communicating with agronomists at Cornell University and inviting and communicating with Japanese and Chinese agronomists. And that these source of personal trajectories cut across national borders in really fascinating ways that these national histories don't really do full justice to.
I think that you hit on so many factors which are not just features of the world that you're describing, but the world that we live in. And I think that really is telling that you have to go. It's a little broken down now because of the access to a lot of information digitally, but the idea that you'd have to get stamps in your passport, to date myself a lot, to go to these different places, even though you're pursuing stories that cut across all of them. In that vein, I'm wondering, you have a lot of individuals who show up in the book, and that's one thing I really appreciate about it, is that you're dealing both with these enormous arcs that literally go around the world and take place over decades or centuries, but you focus on human lives, which I think is really important, since we are all humans, and that's the scale that we can really encounter the world. Do you have a couple of characters who either, I don't want to say necessarily your favorite, but maybe the ones you think are sort of particularly evocative in demonstrating the trends and the stories that you're trying to express?
So one individual I did research on was Isaiah Bowman. I went to Johns Hopkins because he was a former president of Johns Hopkins. Very interesting guy who is Mennonite, and his family migrated south from Canada. There was basically no border crossing. They just moved to Michigan, to rural Michigan. From there, he went to a teacher's college in Michigan, where his intelligence was spotted by his professor, who recommended him to go to Harvard College. From Harvard College, he got a job at Yale teaching summer school. And then from Yale, he did these expeditions in Latin America, which helped to establish his reputation. So in the 1910s, Isaiah Bowman became president of the American Geographical Association. He was then appointed chief territorial specialist for the American delegation to Versailles. And when he returned to the US, became a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The original idea for the council being that it would bring together moneyed elites in New York, policy, and academia. And again, this is a kind of an interesting aside, but in its first years, the Council on Foreign Relations met at the Harvard Club in Midtown Manhattan. And what also makes it very interesting is that Bowman later, as president of Hopkins, but also was seen as Roosevelt's advisor. And he came into contact with Chinese geographers who were brought over by the State Department during the war to encourage exchange with an ally. So this is a case where you start to see he was also exchanging letters with various Chinese intellectuals and political leaders. Carson Chan, for example, corresponded with Bowman, asking about his recommendations for the future direction of Chinese science. And Bowman said, focus on the practical applied sciences. Essentially, the same advice that the Soviet Academy of Sciences also gave to visiting Chinese delegation in the 1950s later on, that you want to focus on these applied areas, on surveying and on the development of various oil and other, taking advantage of natural resources in the country. So this is an example where just this looking into this one person's archives then opened up to all these connections to other people and to these other figures some of whom then I later found in the archives at Academia Sinica in Taipei, and also at the #2 archives in Nanjing.
Did you find, so from Bowman's example, for instance, this is arguing against my earlier question, did you find that the nationality of your subject, when you think about these individuals, did you find that that fundamentally shaped their worldview, or did you find more commonality? We often will talk about like the community of sciences or community of scientists or community of scholars. Did you find that there was commonality among the people because of what their subject matter was, or was it fundamentally shaped by their national identity?
I think it was more this professional connection. And it's very interesting because Bowman was born, he's Mennonite. So here is a group that played multiple roles. They were recruited by Catherine the Great to settle the Crimea in this new Russia in this region. Then the Mennonites moved to Kansas, and where, I mean, it seems to be the new research is that this is maybe not strictly correct, but the Mennonites were credited with bringing this wheat to Kansas. So you have this, he belonged to this one group that crossed these national imperial borders, but his professional career is as a geographer. And here is where you see in this period where the social sciences and the sciences professionalized, they organized international congresses. This International Congress of Geography is still going on. And where then you have bringing together these people and gathering at these conferences from across these different countries around the world. And what brings them together is geography.
Well, and I think it's not coincidental probably that this age you're talking about from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, it was kind of the golden age of geography as a discipline, right? In the United States, I know that it's kind of, there are relatively few departments of geography in American universities these days. It's not the case in the time period that you're writing about. An interesting subject in itself, but I digress. We're about near the end of our time. There's so much in this book, and I've only touched on a very few parts of it, hopefully to suggest to viewers and listeners that they should go and read it for themselves. But are there, what are the parts of the book or the argument of the book that you would most like to draw attention to that I haven't been able to touch on?
I think when we think about geopolitics, it's often from I guess the new term is geostrategic. And it's often from a state perspective. And when these discussions often refer to people kind of like chess pieces, right? You move this population here and there. So the thing that I really want to emphasize is that there's a cost to this. And looking at the lives of individuals, but also looking at those people who are moved to these regions, which are often very, arid or environmentally very difficult terrains, that there is a huge cost to these development schemes. And that when we talk about geopolitics, we still need to pay attention to the human cost.
I think it's a fitting place to conclude, especially for an interview done with the National Committee, where, if I'll put some words in people's mouths, I think that the importance of the individual and people, the difference that people can make in broad and enormous international challenges, I think is fundamental to the National Committee's mission and vision. So, with that, I will simply say thank you so much for this chance to talk about your book, and I look forward to chatting with you about it more, hopefully in person before too long.